Hey guys, it's Graham. Welcome back to Trucker Man Reads. Last weekend I finished reading Thanksgiving, the biography of an American holiday by James W. Baker. That was on the list of 15 books that I did a couple of weeks ago while I was on my staycation. Fantastic and fascinating read. I could do multiple videos on that if we're talking about exploring one particular subject or another. However, the timing on this was quite serendipitous because fellow author and Upstream Reviews contributor Declan Finn posted this that he had originally shared a year ago. He says, "Fun fact, the first Thanksgiving was actually Catholic. It was a traditional Latin Mass of Thanksgiving in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, 55 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock." Now, I've got a few more screen caps here to share. I'll tell you right out of the gate. So far as I've been able to determine, everything that he says here is accurate, but I'm going to provide some context that reinforces my own biases towards Pilgrim supremacy, supported by facts. Anyway, St. Augustine, Florida, the U.S.'s oldest city, was the site of the first Thanksgiving in 1565, when the Spanish founder of St. Augustine, Pedro Menendez de Aviles, and 800 Spanish settlers shared a Mass of Thanksgiving. Following the Mass, Menendez ordered a communal meal to be shared by the Spaniards and the Seloy Indians who occupied the landing site. The nation's first Thanksgiving menu would most likely have consisted of what the Spanish settlers had with them during their voyage: cocido, which is a stew made from salted pork and garbanzo beans, laced with garlic seasoning, hard sea-tack sea biscuits, and red wine. The Seloy natives would have contributed to the meal with wild turkey, venison, gopher tortoise, mullet, corn, beans, and squash. Happy Thanksgiving. So in terms of fare, the food had a lot of overlap with what the Algonquians would have shared with the British Pilgrims up north in 1621. They also grew corn, beans, and squash, and they provided 5 deer for the feast, whereas the corn, beans, and squash also would have come from the Pilgrims' own harvest. They especially had to focus on their corn crops to repay the corn that they had taken from the Patuxets, or the Patuxet grave sites, when they arrived in 1620. Without that, they would have starved, but they did repay that debt. But as to all of this, being factual, yeah, the Spanish arrived in Florida there, and Menendez would found St. Augustine and made inroads with the Seloys there. All of that's correct, but what James W. Baker outlines in his book about Thanksgiving is the genesis of this uniquely American holiday that we have. The overlap comes from the fact that Menendez, being a Spanish Catholic, would have observed this in the tradition of not only the Catholic Mass, but specifically a Mass of Acción de Gracias, which has ties back to even Old Testament Israelite practices. Since the Pilgrims were Anglican separatists, or rather separatists from the Anglican Church, they were focused on strictly biblical practices themselves. Baker emphasizes what their holy days were. They're foreigners to holidays. And since they were a group of mixed faith, you had the strangers and the saints. The strangers were those who were more or less faithful to Anglican traditions and would even celebrate Christmas and so on and so forth. The Puritans, the Pilgrims, they didn't celebrate Christmas because it wasn't a biblical holiday. It came later in Christian tradition. But they would observe formalized fasts and Thanksgivings, because there were celebrated fasts and celebrated days of Thanksgiving, going back to ancient Israelite times. Usually fasting was a matter of we need help or we need to repent, and Thanksgiving then was an act of gratitude towards God. But both of these were formalized events that they observed as a matter of religious reverence and direction to God. The Thanksgiving that we celebrate is a direct descendant of the New England Thanksgiving that was first observed there in 1621. The Pilgrims didn't turn it into a holiday, or so far as we know, like officially commemorate it, mark the date, or anything like that. But there being a harvest festival was just a matter of course with how their industry was timed. You plant in the spring, you tend to your crops throughout the summer, and you harvest at summer's end, and that's when you've got a bunch of bounty, and you give thanks for a bountiful harvest. Um, Later on, when descendants of those pilgrims, as well as other British settlers that came into to North America over the next century or so, as they added themselves to the population, they would proliferate this day of Thanksgiving. And then, as I've touched on before, George Washington really formalized it in 1789, and it stuck for a while, for about 30 years, but then the practice kind of fell out of widely observed popularity. That said, it was still a broadly New England tradition to have a fall harvest Thanksgiving feast. The date would rotate, or not rotate. The date would float around. It depended kind of on your city, your town, or even your family. The formalized date for it would be nailed down a couple of times by a couple of different presidents and leaders over the next 150 years, until it was finally formalized in 1941 under FDR as the fourth Thursday in November. But Baker does the chronological genealogy, we'll say, of tracing all this down, and it is done explicitly in celebration of the Pilgrim Thanksgiving of the 1620s. But that said, in North America, yes, the first known of such events, and there was a lot of overlap in practice and in execution, pun not intended, between what Menindez did and the celebration with the Seloy Indians in 1565. Florida would not become a United States territory until the 1820s. I believe 1822 was when it officially became a territory, and it didn't gain statehood until 1845. Until then, it continued to have strong ties with Spain, and so because of that, its connection to the Spanish-speaking world and not the English-speaking until much later on, this tradition was not absorbed into the larger American culture. It was, if they marked it as a Spanish holiday of any kind, I don't know. But I thought that was a cool way to kind of expound upon the holiday. So shout out to Declan for emphasizing that and putting dates and facts on that. And it was cool to be able to contrast that with the notes that Baker put out. I'm sure I could pull open that book and do a couple of other videos about different subjects here and there. I'm not really into doing YouTube shorts, but it was a really cool book. I give it a hearty endorsement. I'm debating whether or not to throw it on the best of list, but I really liked it. I'm going to buy a copy for my brother. Anyway, check that one out. Drive safe. See you out there.